I never imagined that a simple family gathering could alter the course of my life so profoundly. At 52, I considered myself settled, married for over 2 decades, with two grown children and a career that, while not thrilling, provided stability. My husband, Richard, and I had settled into a comfortable routine, one that many would envy. Yet, beneath the surface, I often felt a yearning for something more, something I couldn't quite define. It was during my mother's second wedding that I met him, Daniel, my new stepbrother. He was the son of my mother's new husband, and though we were both in our 50s, there was an immediate and undeniable connection between us. Tall, with a rugged charm and a mischievous glint in his eyes, Daniel exuded a vitality that was both alluring and unsettling. Our initial conversations were lighthearted, filled with shared anecdotes and laughter. But as the evening progressed, I found myself drawn to him in a way that felt both exhilarating and forbidden. There was a spark, a chemistry that neither of us could ignore. Over the following weeks, family events provided opportunities for our paths to cross. Each encounter intensified the tension between us, a silent acknowledgement of the growing attraction that neither of us dared to voice. It was during a weekend retreat organized by our parents that the boundaries between us blurred irrevocably. A shared bottle of wine, a late night conversation by the fireplace, and the vulnerability of two people seeking connection led to a moment that changed everything. Our first kiss was hesitant, a question posed and answered in the same breath. The subsequent embrace was a surrender to desires long suppressed. In the days that followed, guilt and exhilaration waged a battle within me. I was a wife, a mother, a woman who had always prided herself on her integrity. Yet, with Daniel, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in years. Our affair, though clandestine, became a refuge, a space where I could rediscover parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I don't believe in accidents anymore. Not after what happened with Daniel. The weekend retreat had opened a door I hadn't even realized existed. And once that door was open, it was impossible to close it. We didn't talk about what happened that night, not at first. But our eyes told stories that our mouths couldn't. Every glance was a whisper, every casual touch a spark waiting to ignite again. Back home, I returned to my quiet life with Richard, a man who had become more a habit than a partner. We shared routines, meals, bedsheets. But the intimacy? That had evaporated years ago. We coexisted. We were functional. And maybe that had been enough until now. Daniel, on the other hand, was texting me. It started with harmless jokes, memes, little inside references to our family. But gradually the messages became more personal. He remembered details about my life no one else bothered with. What wine I liked, the way I brushed my hair behind my ear when I was nervous, that I always slept on the left side of the bed. He noticed me. He made me feel seen. One afternoon, as rain softly patted against the windows, I received a text from him. Home alone. Coffee. I stared at it for a long moment. My thumb hovered above the screen. I typed and erased at least 5 different responses. Finally, I wrote, sure. 20 minutes. I told Richard the first was running to the store for almond milk. Daniel opened the door shirtless, his skin damp from a recent shower. I felt my breath catch in my throat. He didn't say anything. He just looked at me with that same amused, devil-may-care glint in his eye. I walked in, and as soon as the door closed behind me, he kissed me. It was rougher this time, urgent. Coffee was forgotten. We barely made it to the couch. It wasn't just sex, although that too was dizzying. It was the way he touched me like I was made of fire and silk at once. The way he whispered things in my ear that made me shiver. The way he asked what I liked, what I wanted, and then gave it to me tenfold. I had forgotten what that felt like. To be wanted. To be consumed. The affair intensified. We met in secret, cafes on the other side of town, bookstores, even a discreet Airbnb once when our parents were away for a week. We had a language of our own. Hidden cues, suggestive texts, stories we made up to cover our absences. I was a woman reborn. I paid attention to my appearance again. Bought new lingerie I didn't even wear for Richard. I started running again, rediscovered jazz music, cooked more elaborate meals. My friends noticed. They complimented me on my glow, asked if I was on some new skincare regime. No one suspected the truth. That the heat simmering beneath my skin came from Daniel's mouth on my body, his words echoing in my ears. But the euphoria came with a price. Every lie I told Richard was a little cut, a slow unraveling of the life I had built. He wasn't a bad man. He just didn't see me anymore. And now, I was too afraid to show him who I had become. Daniel, on the other hand, was intoxicating and unpredictable. He would show up unannounced, kiss me like we had days to make up for. Other times, he'd disappear into his work for days, leaving me in a haze of longing and uncertainty. I began craving not just the physicality of him, but the emotional escape he provided. He made me laugh in a way I hadn't laughed in years. He challenged me, teased me, made me feel younger, bolder, alive. And one night, as we lay tangled in each other, our breathing slowing, he brushed his fingers down my spine and murmured, "What if we weren't just sneaking around?" The question hung in the air, heavy, dangerous. I didn't answer. I didn't know how. The line between fantasy and reality was beginning to blur, and I wasn't sure which side I belonged to anymore. I should have ended it after that weekend in Lakewood, but I didn't. Instead, I created more reasons to see him. Family brunches. Errands my mother didn't ask me to run. Dropping by his office under the excuse of needing to borrow a book or ask his advice on something trivial. I began arranging my days like stepping stones that led to Daniel. My husband, Richard, never suspected a thing. He was consumed with work, new responsibilities at the firm, a restructuring he often vented about but secretly relished. At home, we shared meals, watched TV, even had sex once or twice, but my body wasn't there. Not fully. It felt like muscle memory, like brushing my teeth or folding laundry. Daniel, on the other hand, touched me like I was something new each time. It wasn't just the sex, though. God, the sex was, there's no delicate way to put it. It was ravenous. I don't know how else to describe it. We were two people with decades of life behind us, yet somehow our bodies spoke in a language I didn't know I could still speak fluently. He kissed me like he needed to memorize me. His mouth on my thighs, his hands, strong but never rough, held me in ways that made me forget I had ever belonged to someone else. There was one afternoon I can't forget. It was late October, cool and cold outside. I told Richard the first was going to pottery class. I'd signed up weeks before to cover my tracks, though I'd never stepped foot inside the studio. Daniel had a key to a small beach house just south of the city. I drove there, heart pounding, thighs warm beneath my skirt as I thought about what would happen the moment I walked through that door. He was waiting for me in the kitchen, shirt half buttoned, barefoot. We didn't even speak at first. He looked at me, just looked, and I dropped my bag and went to him. We kissed until I was out of breath. He lifted me onto the kitchen counter, and we made love right there, sunlight filtering through the blinds, my legs wrapped around his waist, the scent of cinnamon and salt water in the air. It was messy, hungry, and so profoundly intimate that I cried afterward. Not from guilt, though it was always there like a background hum, but from the sheer intensity of being seen, desired. He held me afterward, my head on his bare chest, both of us sweaty and sated. "You make me feel young again," he whispered. I laughed against his skin. "You make me feel like I never knew what love was." The words hung between us, heavier than I intended. I hadn't meant to say love, but neither of us corrected it. We didn't need to. Later, as we lay tangled in sheets that smelled like him, I asked, "Do you ever think about what this is?" Daniel looked at me with those thoughtful, ocean-colored eyes. "Every damn day. But you don't want to stop." He ran a thumb across my collarbone, slow and deliberate. "I'd rather lose everything than lose this." And for a moment, I believed him. The danger of an affair in your 50s isn't the impulsiveness, it's the control. The experience you bring to the betrayal. You know how to erase text messages. You understand how to keep your scent neutral. You know your spouse's habits, schedules, weak spots. You don't fumble. You finesse. But that's also what makes it dangerous. You think you can handle it. We became too good at the lie. I'd look at Richard and smile like nothing had changed. He'd compliment dinner, touch my hip in passing, and I'd return the gesture with a practiced ease. My children noticed nothing. Even my mother, who had a sixth sense for this kind of thing, was too wrapped up in her second honeymoon to notice how often Daniel and I locked eyes across the table. But something was shifting. It was no longer just about lust. We began to share more of ourselves. Old scars, hidden fears, things we hadn't told anyone. Daniel admitted he'd never really loved his ex-wife, that he stayed for the children, that he often felt invisible in a room full of people. I told him about my miscarriage in '98, the one Richard barely spoke about after it happened. I told him how alone I'd felt in that house, even with my family all around me. He listened, really listened. And then, without warning, he started pulling back. It started subtly. Texts took longer to come. Weekend plans were suddenly not great timing. He claimed work was picking up, that his kids needed him more. And yet, I knew what distance felt like. I'd lived in its shadow for 20 years. Still, I clung to the hope that it was temporary, that he was just overwhelmed. One night, lying beside Richard in bed, I sent Daniel a message. "You're pulling away. If you want out, just say it." The typing bubble appeared, then disappeared. Then, finally, "I don't want out, but I'm scared. This is getting too real. Too real." I stared at the message, numb. I wanted to scream. Of course it's real. We're real. But instead, I wrote, "Then let's be honest with each other. No games." There was no reply that night, or the next day. 2 days later, he showed up at my doorstep. No warning. Just rang the bell while I was chopping onions for dinner. I opened the door and saw him. Face pale, eyes tired, lips pressed into a line. "I couldn't stay away," he said. "But I can't pretend we're not hurting people, either." I let him in. We didn't speak much. We just held each other. There was no sex that night. Just skin against skin. Silence, breathing, tears I pretended not to see. By winter, something had changed in me too. I'd started looking at Richard differently. Not with guilt, but with curiosity. Who was this man I'd shared a life with? What did we lose along the way? I started sleeping in later, going for long walks, journaling. I stopped lying so much, even to myself. Daniel and I kept seeing each other, but less frequently. We became more careful, less reckless, but also more emotionally exposed. He talked about possibly moving out of state. I asked if he meant to leave me. He said, "No, but if we can't have all of each other, what are we doing?" I had no answer. One night, back at the beach house, curled beside him, I whispered, "Would you ever want to be with me for real?" He was quiet. Then, "Yes, but not like this. Not hiding. Not half of you." "And what about your kids? Your father?" He exhaled, long and tired. "That's what keeps me up at night." We both stared at the ceiling, knowing we'd reached the point of no return. We were no longer a fling. We were a choice. And eventually, one of us would have to make it. By early spring, something inside me was beginning to fracture. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. It was more like fatigue, emotional exhaustion from living between two lives, from constantly checking my phone before opening a door, from pausing before speaking just to make sure I didn't call Daniel by name when I meant Richard. I was still seeing Daniel, but our meetings had changed. They were quieter, more introspective. We didn't just take each other's clothes off anymore. We unwrapped memories, regrets, and questions we didn't dare ask when it all started. It wasn't about escape now. It was about truth. And sometimes, the truth was unbearable. One afternoon, we met at a hotel in the city. Not one of our usual cozy hideaways, but a colder, more corporate place with white linens and gray carpets that smelled of bleach and restraint. We ordered room service. He poured me a glass of Chardonnay, and I noticed his hands trembling slightly. "Is everything okay?" I asked, even though I already knew something wasn't. Daniel looked at me for a long time before answering. "I've been thinking about ending it." There it was. The blow. Delivered not cruelly, but honestly. "Because of your kids?" I asked. "Your father?" or because you don't feel the same anymore. He ran a hand through his hair. It's not that I don't feel the same. I feel too much. I love you. I didn't mean to, but I do. And it's terrifying. I stared down at my glass. So what? You love me, but it's too much, so you'd rather have nothing? No, he said quickly, taking my hand. It's just, every day I think about what it would mean to keep doing this. To keep lying. To hurt people who trust us. People who don't see us. I said, and I felt my voice rise. Who don't ask what we need. Who stopped listening years ago. I know, he said. But is that enough of a reason to blow up our lives? I didn't answer. I couldn't, because I was asking myself the same thing. That night, I went home to Richard. He was watching a documentary about the Civil War, half asleep on the sofa, a glass of scotch balanced on his belly. I sat beside him and tried to imagine telling him the truth. I couldn't, not because I didn't want to, but because I knew it would destroy something in him. Richard wasn't cruel. He wasn't unfaithful. He was simply finished. He'd stopped seeing me long before I stopped looking for him. And now I wondered, if I had spoken up earlier, if I had been bolder or needier or just louder, could this have all been different? The next morning, I went to a cafe alone. I needed space. I left my phone on silent and took a notebook from my bag, the one I'd been journaling in for weeks now. And I wrote, I love two men. One I built a life with, one I built a secret with. The first gives me stability. The second gives me breath. I don't want to burn my world down, but I can't keep living in the ashes either. I didn't realize I was crying until the woman at the next table handed me a tissue. Sorry, I said with a half laugh. Allergies. She smiled gently. Spring's tricky like that. Yes, spring is tricky. It's the season of newness, of blooming and cracking open. But it also splits things apart. Daniel and I went another 2 weeks without seeing each other. It wasn't dramatic. It was careful. He sent a message once every few days. I replied, but shorter. Neither of us said what we really felt. I wondered if he was seeing someone else. I didn't ask. I wouldn't have blamed him. But it wasn't over. Not yet. A storm rolled in one weekend, literally. Heavy rain, thunder, streets flooded, and trees bent with wind. Richard was out of town at a legal conference in Boston. I was curled up with tea and a book when my phone buzzed. It was Daniel. I can't sleep. I miss your skin. I stared at the message for a full minute, then typed, come over. Now. He did. He arrived soaked, his coat clinging to him like a second skin. I met him at the door with a towel. We barely spoke. The electricity flickered in the house, and with a storm outside, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us. We made love on the living room floor, slow, soaked in candlelight. Every kiss tasted like memory. Every breath was a question. Is this the last time? When it was over, I lay against him and whispered, we can't keep doing this. He nodded. I know, but I don't know how to stop. And that was the most honest thing either of us had said in weeks. The next morning, I told him not to call for a while. I need space, I said, heart pounding. Okay, he replied, pulling me close. But space isn't goodbye. It's just breathing room. I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. The silence stretched. 1 week. Then 2. He kept his word. No texts. No emails. Nothing. I told myself I was relieved. That it gave me time to think. That I could be present again. Focus on my marriage, on my home, on the people who didn't know I'd become someone else entirely. And in some ways, I did. Richard and I even went away for a weekend. Wine country. A charming inn, the kind of trip we hadn't taken in years. It was nice. We walked, talked a little, slept beside each other in a 4-poster bed with antique quilts and no ghosts. But it felt like wearing someone else's clothes. One night, a month after Daniel and I last spoke, I saw him again. Unplanned. At my mother's house. She was hosting a small family dinner, her way of pretending we were all one big happy unit. Daniel was there, looking thinner. Pale. Tired. He smiled at me across the table, but it didn't reach his eyes. We barely spoke. A few pleasantries, a handshake, a polite "how are you?" But when I got up to help clear dishes, he followed me into the kitchen. When we were alone, he leaned in and whispered, "I still love you, just so you know." Then he left, and I stood there with a dish in my hand and a storm inside me that had nothing to do with the weather. Spring turned into summer with a kind of heavy grace. The kind you feel in your chest before you feel it in the air. The world around me kept spinning: dinner parties, weddings, garden chores, group texts with college friends, but I'd stepped outside of it, even as I performed my part. I still laughed when I was expected to, still made love to Richard when he reached for me, still answered phone calls from my children, gave advice, remembered birthdays. But somewhere deep inside, I had entered a long, strange silence. And then one morning, that silence broke. I was sitting at our kitchen table with a cup of weak tea, watching sunlight crawl across the tile floor. Richard had already left for the office, and I was flipping through a catalog when the mail arrived. It was the usual clutter: bills, offers, newsletters, but then I saw it. A letter. Handwritten. No return address. But I knew the handwriting instantly. I'd memorized the way he formed his Ds. I opened it slowly, fingers trembling the way they hadn't in months. "I don't know how to be in your life without being in your arms. I've tried to make sense of that, to respect your space. But nothing feels real anymore. Not without you. I still want you. Not just your body, though God knows I do. I want your voice in my mornings, your sighs in my nights. I want a life we don't have to hide. Tell me to go, and I'll go. But if there's still a part of you that believes in us, even a little, then I'll wait. I'll wait until your silence says otherwise." I pressed the paper to my lips. Then I cried. Not because I was sad. Not because I missed him. But because I finally understood what I needed. That evening, I waited for Richard to come home. I made his favorite: roast chicken with rosemary, garlic mashed potatoes, steamed asparagus. I set the table. I lit the candles, not because I was pretending everything was fine, but because I wanted this moment to feel sacred, like an ending should. He came in around 7, loosened his tie, kissed me on the cheek. "Smells amazing," he said. "You're spoiling me." "No," I said gently. "I'm saying goodbye." He turned confused. "What?" I sat him down, and I told him. Not every detail, I spared him that. But I told him the truth: that I had fallen in love with someone else, that I had been unfaithful, that it hadn't been fleeting, that it had changed me. And then I told him what hurt the most: that I let myself disappear for years. I said, voice steady, and neither of us noticed. He didn't shout. He didn't throw anything. He just looked at me, broken, stunned, and nodded. "I think I knew," he said softly. "But I didn't want to know." We talked for a long time about our years together, our kids, the house we built, the things we got right, and the things we didn't. And then I left. Not angrily, not tragically. I packed a small bag, got in the car, and drove to a hotel by the lake. I didn't call Daniel. Not yet. I needed one night, just one, to sit with myself, to breathe without belonging to anyone. I watched the sun set over the water, wrapped in a hotel robe, sipping wine alone. I listened to a playlist I'd made years ago and hadn't touched since. I looked at myself in the mirror and didn't flinch. In the morning, I wrote a letter. To Daniel. Yes. Yes to mornings. Yes to nights. Yes to being whole. But not as a secret. Not as a half-truth. As something we claim fully. I'm not running from anything now. I'm walking toward something, toward us. And then I drove to him. No grand scene. No sweeping cinematic music. Just me, pulling up outside his apartment, heart racing like I was 25 again. He opened the door before I could knock. Neither of us spoke. He just reached for me, and I stepped into him, and into a new life I was finally ready for. It wasn't perfect. Real life never is. There were long conversations with my children. Some awkward, some tearful, some healing. There were legal papers and quiet holidays and moments I missed the familiarity of what I had. There were dinners with Daniel where we didn't agree. Days when I wondered if I had traded one kind of loneliness for another. But there were also mornings with coffee and shared crossword puzzles. There was laughter in the kitchen and skin on skin without shame. There were long walks, open windows, the feeling of being chosen, and choosing back. There was honesty. And there was breath. If you had told me 5 years ago that I'd leave the man I'd built a life with for the man I wasn't supposed to touch, I would have laughed you out of the room. But now, as I sit here, barefoot, 60, loved, and awake in my own skin, I don't regret a thing. Because the truth is, I didn't just fall in love with Daniel. I came back to myself. And that, more than anything, is the real ending. The kind that lasts.